We begin this episode by acknowledging the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land where we gather to record and share these stories. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and recognise the deep cultural knowledge, connection and care that have guided this country across generations. We also extend that respect to any First Nations peoples listening or watching today's episode. As we journey beyond the veil, we do so with gratitude and respect, mindful of the footsteps that came before us and the stories held in this country. May we listen deeply, learn with humility, and move forward with integrity and heart. Welcome to Beyond the Veil Australia podcast, a space where stories, experiences, and the unexplained meet in ways that stay with us long after the moment has passed. I'm Heather, your guide through the shadows and the host of Beyond the Veil Australia podcast. Together, we'll explore the cases that stay with us, the ones with layers beneath the surface, threads waiting to be followed, and voices that deserve the time and attention to be understood. As this season unfolds, more voices join the journey, co-hosts and guests who carry their own pieces of the story through conversation, reflection, and careful attention to detail. We'll follow each case where it leads, uncovering the threads that shift our understanding of the unknown. These aren't just encounters, they're experiences that stay with us. And as we move through each story, we're paying attention to the shifts, the echoes, and the quiet truths that only come forward when you're willing to sit with them long enough. In Season 1, we lifted the veil. In Season 2, we stepped through. And this season, we descend. And now, the descent is open. So follow it where it leads, because the way forward runs down. Hello and welcome back to Beyond the Veil Australia podcast with me, your host Heather, and of course a massive welcome to Season 3. So this season is going to be a little bit different to Season 1 and 2. So obviously with Season 1 and 2 I explored more the topical kind of stories, and this season I've actually gone back through the Season 1 and Season 2, and I do remember saying it in many episodes, there were a lot of cases that I wanted to explore more in depth. And so that's what Season 3 is about exploring more individualized cases in some of the topics that we've already covered. Some of these cases are well known, some of them are not so well known. And that's why I was really excited to look at Season 3 with a completely different lens. And so today we are going to be starting with a particular UAP story that I find really, really fascinating. One, because it's an Australian UAP story. And two, because it's in a place in Victoria that I have travelled through several times on my way to visit my sister who lives in a different part of the state to me. So interestingly for the few years that she's lived there, I'd never even heard about this particular town, let alone the fact that it had a UAP encounter back in the 80s. So when I'd learnt about that in my very first episodes of my podcast around the You've Got to Be Joking episodes, I was very, very intrigued and knew that I wanted to dive in and cover it. So, yeah, whilst there are ones like Westall, and I am very aware that we have just passed the 60th anniversary of Westall, it has had a lot of coverage, and it deserves to have a lot of coverage because it's a very interesting and crazy case. But this one I'm really keen to kind of explore because it's a bit closer to home for me in that sense that I have connection to the area without even knowing. So, yeah, this one is Rosedale in Victoria, Australia. So, buckle up for a great episode around the story and the case of the Rosedale UFO incident. I hope that you like this. And yeah, let me know in the comments if there's anything that you know of. Some more of the lesser known cases are always fun to explore because you just learn so much more, and I think you don't sometimes understand just how frequent some of these things are until you do a little bit of extra research and digging. So I really wanted to start off season 3 with a case that really piqued my interest from the very beginning of the podcast. So here we go with the Rosedale UFO incident. The sound that didn't belong. There are places in Australia where the night feels older than the land itself. Places where the darkness doesn't just fall, it settles. Thick, heavy, familiar, like a blanket pulled over the world. Gippsland is one of those places. Out here, the sky stretches wide and low, a dark bowl holding the quiet in place. The paddocks roll out in long, gentle ways, broken only by the silhouettes of gum trees and the occasional farmhouse light burning like a lone ember in the distance. On most nights, nothing happens. The cattle shift, the wind moves through the cypress hedges in long, slow breaths. The Princes Highway hums softly, a distant reminder that somewhere beyond the darkness, the world is still awake. But on the night of September 30th, 1980, the quiet broke. It didn't shatter, it didn't explode. It pierced. A single sound, sharp, metallic, unnatural, that cut through the stillness like a blade. A whistle, high, shrill. A sound that didn't belong to the land or the animals or the machines that we know. Inside a small farmhouse on a property called White Acres, a 54-year-old caretaker jolted awake. He wasn't a man who startled easily. He lived beside the Princes Highway long enough to know every sound that passed through the night. Every truck, every fox, every shifting branch. But this sound was different. It had weight, direction, intent. And beneath it, almost hidden, was something else. The cattle were bellowing, not restless, not irritated, but terrified. A horse tore across the paddock, hooves striking the earth in frantic, uneven rhythm. Their caretaker sat up in bed, heart pounding, listening. The whistle rose again, a metallic cry that seemed to vibrate in the air rather than travel through it. He swung his legs out of bed, feet hitting the cold floorboards, and for a moment he just stood there listening to the night unravel. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to step into one of Australia's most extraordinary and most overlooked close encounter cases. He opened the door, and the world outside was not the world that he knew. This is Rosedale. The land, the man, and the night. Before we return to the moment the caretaker stepped outside, we need to understand the world he lived in. Because encounters don't just happen in a vacuum. They happen in places, and places that shape people, and people shape the way stories are carried through time. White Acres wasn't just a property, it was a life. 8 kilometres outside of Rosedale, the farm sat on a gentle rise overlooking long paddocks that stretched toward the tree line like slow green tide. The soil was dark and rich, the kind that holds moisture long after the sun has gone down. The cypress hedge ran along the edge of the yard, a thick, towering wall of green that blocked the wind and cast deep shadows, even on moonlit nights. The silo stood tall beside the shed, its metal sides catching whatever light the night offered. And the 10,000-gallon concrete water tank, massive and a round structure, sat like a silent guardian in the yard. This was a place built for work, not beauty. But there's a kind of beauty in that too. The honest kind. The kind that comes from routine and repetition and knowing the land like an old friend. The caretaker knew his place intimately. He knew how the cattle behaved when a storm was coming. He knew the sound of the wind moving through the hedge. He knew the rhythm of the highway, the way the trucks downshifted as they approached the bend, the way the sound carried across the paddocks at night. He knew what belonged here and what didn't. He was 54 years old in 1980, a man shaped by work, by early mornings and long days, by the quiet companionship of animals and the steady hum of rural life. He wasn't a man who scared easily. He wasn't a man who embellished stories. He wasn't a man who sought attention. He was the kind of witness investigators dream of, grounded, observant, with no reason to invent anything and every reason to tell the truth plainly. On the night of September 30th, 1980, the air was cool and still. No wind, no rain, no storm on the horizon. Just the quiet hum of the highway and the soft shifting of the cattle settling in for the night. The caretaker had gone to bed early, as he always did. He slept lightly, a habit formed from years of listening for trouble in the paddocks. And when the whistle cut through the night, he woke instantly. Not confused, not groggy, just alert. He sat up, listening. The whistle came again, sharp, metallic, a sound that seemed to slice through the air rather than travel through it. He frowned. That wasn't a fox, and that wasn't a truck. That wasn't anything that he recognised. Then he heard the cattle, not restless, not irritated, panicked. A deep, guttural bellowing that rolled across the paddocks like a warning. The horse's hooves followed, fast, uneven, frantic, as it tore across the yard. The caretaker swung his legs out of bed, feet hitting the cold floorboards. He stood for a moment, listening to the night unravel. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. He reached for the door, opened it, and stepped outside. The air was cold against his skin. The darkness felt heavier than usual, as if the night itself was holding its breath. He took a few steps forward, eyes adjusting, ears straining. That whistle rose again, closer now, sharper, vibrating in the air like a tensioned wire. And then he saw it. A movement, a shape, a presence. Something large, something structured, something that did not belong to this land or this night or this world. But that moment, the moment he first laid eyes on that craft, belongs to the next part. Because to understand what he saw, we need to understand how the world looked in the seconds before it appeared. The paddocks, the hedge, the shed, the silo, the tank, and the silence. All of it holding its breath as something impossible moved through the dark. And now we step into the encounter. The caretaker stood in the doorway for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dark. The night felt wrong. Not necessarily dangerous, and not storm-charged. Just wrong. The air had a thickness to it, a kind of pressure that made the skin on his arms prickle. He took a few steps forward, bare feet sinking into the cool earth. The cattle were still bellowing, their calls rolling across the paddocks in an uneven wave. The horse paced the fence line, snorting, ears pinned back, and its body was tense and alert. And then the whistle rose again, sharp, metallic. A sound that seemed to vibrate inside his chest rather than travel through the air. He turned toward the shed, the hedge, the open yard beyond. And that's when he saw it. It was just a movement at first, like a shape emerging from the darkness. Something large, something structured, and something that moved with a kind of deliberate grace that no aircraft he'd ever seen could actually match. It glided from right to left across the property. Low, impossibly low, no more than 8 to 10 feet above the ground. Low enough to see its outline, low enough to judge its size, low enough to feel the wrongness of that pit in his stomach. The object passed between the shed and the cypress hedge, a narrow gap that no helicopter could navigate. No plane would be able to survive. No known craft could slip through that without noise, wind, or even chaos for that matter. But this is the thing. This thing moved like it belonged there. Smooth, controlled, precise. The caretaker stepped further into the yard, heart pounding, eyes locked onto this craft. It was large, around 26 feet across, 15 feet high, with a domed top that caught what little light the night had offered. The upper section was pale, almost white, while the underside was darker, shadowed, and ringed with lights that glowed in shifting tones of orange and blue. Not flashing, not strobing, just glowing. Steady, deliberate, as if the craft were breathing. The whistle rose again, louder now, sharper, a metallic cry that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The caretaker felt it in his teeth. He watched, frozen, as this craft approached the 10,000-gallon concrete water tank. It slowed, hovered, held its position with stillness. And this stillness defied everything he understood about machines. There was no wind, no rotor wash, no vibration in the ground. There was no engine noise, just the whistle, and the animals in panic, and the impossible presence of a craft that seemed to move with intelligence. The caretaker took another step forward, drawn toward it despite the fear rising in his chest. The craft hovered over the tank for what felt like minutes, but later he would estimate that it would be around 60 seconds. Long enough to study it, long enough to know that this wasn't a trick of the light, long enough to understand that he was looking at something that did not belong to this world. Then, slowly and deliberately, the craft began to descend. Not like a falling object, not like a landing aircraft, but like something lowering itself with intention It settled into a stationary position just above the ground. A silent, hovering presence that seemed to observe the world around it. The caretaker held his breath. The whistle softened. The animals slightly quietened, though their bodies were still trembling. For just a moment, a long, suspended moment, the world felt impossibly still. And then, without warning, the craft lifted. Smooth, effortless, and silent. It rose a few feet, shifted its angle, and glided across the property before disappearing into the darkness, as if it had never been there at all. The whistle faded, the night returned, but nothing felt the same. The caretaker stood alone in the yard, heart pounding, breath shallow, trying to understand what he had just witnessed. He didn't have words for it, not yet. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Nothing human-made moves like that. Let's have a little time out at this section right now. That has given me goosebumps. And I've, when I put my scripts together, like I'm reading this all the time as I'm putting things together. I'm reading the research. I'm doing all of that sort of stuff. But there's something that I have to say, and I know it's happened in other episodes as well, but there are times where I can be putting things together and not necessarily get the chills or feel like there's a presence or anything like that. And because I'm in pure structure, put together mode, I think there's a level of disconnect that comes with that, where you're just going, I need this information and I need to script it like this. And you're doing it in sections. Whereas when you're going through everything together, kind of undisturbed and really immersing yourself in that story, that's when things happen. That's when I notice I get things like goosebumps, or I feel confirmation or presence or something comes through. And the goosebumps just won't go. And I'm going to say, at the time of recording this, I am still pregnant and I'm really, really hot. It probably, if you're watching on YouTube, it probably doesn't look like I'm sweating up, but I can certainly feel it. I have my window open in my office area. It's not cold, but to feel the goosebumps really kind of come through all of a sudden, particularly literally on that last sentence where it's nothing human made moves like that. That is when I felt that rush of goosebumps. That's when I felt like that was confirmation of some form. And it's like they just settle and then they start coming back. And it's just weird because it's a sunny autumn day here. It's quite warm. There's no reason for me to be getting goosebumps like that. And to only be getting goosebumps on my arms. I'm not getting them through the rest of my body. It's just on my arms, which is even weirder, particularly because I can feel that I am quite hot. To only feel it on my arms is really, really strange. But that to me just felt like confirmation that it's like, well, and I know there's been a lot of progress in this area around UAP and UFO phenomena. So it's just weird. It's just weird. I just have to put that in there. But this case is really, it gave me the goosebumps, I'm pretty sure, when I actually first looked at it in my earlier episodes. A lot of things came up for me in those UAP episodes that sort of shocked me, and I was a bit like, why am I picking this up or channeling this or whatever? I found it really interesting because I just, and another disclosure, if you haven't listened to those episodes, it was weird that I actually chose to have them first. And the it's so weird because for the longest time, I've always like paranormal, ghosts, spirits, spirituality, all of that sort of stuff always really fascinated me. I never really had much of a fear around it. Like, yes, there was a bit of fear when I was still learning about it, like in the initial parts of that growth. But I always had this horrendous fear around the universe in the context of UAP. And I don't know why I did. I'm sure if I did some meditation, I'd probably find out. But it was really strange that I'd had such a like crippling anxiety or fear about it. And I'd watched a documentary. It was probably in 2021, 2022, because I remember my second child was still like under the age of 1. And it was, I think it was 7 News Spotlight. So for those in Australia, it's like the Channel 7 version of 60 Minutes. And for those abroad, it's basically a 60 Minutes program, more or less. And I'm pretty certain that Ross Coulthart was actually he was still working in mainstream media at the time, and he had done the Spotlight episode, and it was talking about UAP phenomena, and not just abroad. He was looking at certain cases around Australia. And I don't know why, but the way that was presented, it actually switched that anxiety and fear into pure intrigue and like this overwhelming feeling of like, this isn't actually that scary. It's really fucking cool. I need to know more. And it was so strange because it was just like it was like someone flicked a switch. I'd gone from immense fear into intrigue, and I still can't explain that. And then over, those few years as well of exploring more and then starting to understand just how connected everything was, I found myself really, really, really drawn to the UAP phenomena at the moment. And I know that it's kind of like a bit of a hot topic at the moment because there is so much happening with it. But I think that's why I'm really fascinated, because I think it's something that, in order to understand some of the other elements of the paranormal, having a bit more of an understanding of the UAP phenomena, consciousness, all of that sort of stuff, I think actually helps explain a little bit more in the paranormal spiritual area. So once I'd sort of overcome that fear, that's when I was like, oh my God. And then I started learning that UAP didn't just happen in one place in the world. It happens everywhere. And then the more I learned about what's happened here in Australia, the more I'm like, holy hell, how do we not know about these stories? Like even Westall, like I didn't learn about that until very recently, in recent years. And then I connected the dots that Westall is actually a suburb that's on the train line that I would take from my suburb right into the heart of Melbourne. And then when I figured that out, I was like, holy fucking shit, how have I not heard or known about any of these things? But then I also think about it and kind of go, well, potentially that there was still a lot of that fear in there that maybe I just blocked it out. But it is really interesting just how much more drawn into this particular area I've felt myself being pulled into. And I think for me, it's helping connect dots in other areas of the paranormal. And that's what I love about exploring some of these more individual cases, which is why I was like, I've done a really big overview of these sorts of things in my first and second seasons. So now's the opportunity to really pick some of those and just dive in and explore them more. And of course, bring some of them to light that may not be very well known, even in Australia, let alone around the world. So, definitely there are cases like the Rendlesham UFO and Roswell and, some of those really big, well-known global cases. But that was where it was kind of like, yes, they're so fascinating and God, you could go on for years. But What about some of those smaller ones that just don't get recognised, and what can we learn about those and see how they correlate or how similar they might be to some of these more major cases? And, what are the similarities? What are the differences? What have we learned from all of these different things, apart from the fact that everyone wanted to keep it quiet? But that's what I find really interesting, is just about learning about just what's experienced in these moments. And yeah, so I hope that you're enjoying Rosedale so far. I've had a little ramble there, but I just had to throw that in there because I did get that big wave of goosebumps like right then and there. And it was a little bit like, okay, something's happening. So yeah, without further ado, we're going to kind of continue on the rest of this journey and see what else we can uncover together. The aftermath, the silence, the shock, and the weight of what remains. When the craft vanished into the darkness, the night didn't return all at once. It came back in pieces. First, the whistle faded, the metallic cry dissolving into the air as if it had never existed at all. Then the cattle quietened, their bellowing softening into an uneasy murmur that rolled across the paddocks like aftershocks. The horse had slowed its frantic pacing, though its body still trembled. Muscles were still twitching beneath its coat, as if the fear had nowhere to go. And then the silence settled. Not the familiar quiet of a Gippsland night, not the soft hum of the highway or the gentle rustle of the wind through the hedge. This silence was different. It was thick, heavy, charged. A silence that felt like the world was holding its breath long after that danger had passed. The caretaker stood alone in the yard, bare feet on the cold earth, heart pounding in his chest. He didn't move at first. He didn't speak. Didn't even breathe properly. He just stared into the darkness where the craft had disappeared, trying to make sense of what he'd seen. His mind had raced, not with explanations, but with the absence of them. He knew aircraft. He knew weather. And he knew the land. Just like he knew the animals. And nothing in this world, nothing that he understood, moved like that. He took a slow breath, cold air burning in his lungs. The night felt wrong. Not dangerous anymore, just altered. As if something had passed through and left a residue behind. He turned slowly, torch in hand, and began to walk the property. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the familiar shapes of the yard, the shed, the hedge, the silo, and the tank. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. He walked toward where the water tank was, the place where the craft had hovered. The concrete was cool beneath his hand. There was no scorch marks, no heat, no damage. Just the faint smell of damp earth and the lingering tension in the air. He moved between the gap in the shed and the hedge, the narrow passage that this craft had slipped through with impossible precision. He shone a torch along the hedge. There was no broken branches, no disturbed leaves, no sign that anything had passed through there at all. He checked the ground. There wasn't necessarily impressions or burn marks, or even disturbed soil, but there was something. It was as if the craft had moved through the world without touching it, but still leaving a slight mark. He walked toward the spot where it had descended, a place where it had hovered just above the ground. The soil was cool beneath his fingers. The grass wasn't burnt, but the earth was slightly disturbed. He crouched there for a moment, torchlight flickering across the ground, trying to reconcile what he'd seen with what the world was showing him now. There really wasn't a lot of evidence and not a lot of proof. Just a memory of a craft that moved with intelligence and silence and had left the world unchanged, except for the man and the animals who witnessed it. He stood slowly, knees stiff, and looked out across the paddocks. The cattle had settled, though they were huddled closer than usual, their bodies pressed together as if seeking comfort. The horse stood still now, ears flicking, eyes wide, and still very much alert. The caretaker felt this heaviness in his chest. Not fear, but something deeper. A sense of being seen, of being observed, of being a part of something that he didn't understand and couldn't explain. He walked back toward the house, torchlight bobbing across the yard. The night felt colder now, sharper, as if the air itself had changed. He paused at the door, looking back one last time at the place where the craft had hovered. The silence pressed in around him. He stepped inside, closed the door, and sat at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a mug he didn't remember making. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night. He just sat there, listening to the quiet, waiting for the whistle to return. But it didn't. The memory of it, that sharp metallic cry that cut through the stillness, echoed in his mind long after the sun rose. And when morning came, he knew he had to tell someone. Not because he wanted attention, not because he wanted to believe anything extraordinary, but because he needed answers, and because he knew with absolute certainty that what he had seen was not a trick of the light, and it was not a dream, and not a misinterpretation. This was real, and it didn't belong in this world. The investigators arrive. By morning, the caretaker felt hollow, not frightened, not confused, just unsettled. The night had left a residue, a kind of emotional static that clung to him long after the sun rose over the paddocks. He moved through his chores on autopilot, feeding the cattle, checking the fences, walking the yard with the same steps he'd taken 1,000 times before. But everything felt different. The shed, the hedge, the silo, and the water tank. All the familiar landmarks of his world now carried the memory of something impossible moving silently through the dark. He didn't want to tell anyone at first. And not because he just didn't want to, but because he didn't know how. How do you explain something that left really no trace, but changed everything? But word travels in rural communities, even when you didn't speak it aloud. And within days, the story reached the ears of the people who knew exactly what to do with it. 3 investigators, each with their own methods, their own philosophies, their own way of seeing the phenomenon, made their way to Whiteacres. Bill Chalker, Gary Little, and Keith Basterfield. Names that carry weight in the history of Australian UFO research. They didn't arrive together. They didn't collaborate in the formal sense. But their work, taken as a whole, forms one of the most detailed examinations of a rural close encounter case in this country. And each of them saw something different in Rosedale. Bill Chalker, known as the Pattern Seeker. Bill Chalker was one of the first to take the Rosedale case seriously. He approached the property like a forensic scene, not with sensationalism, but with method. He walked the caretaker's path step by step, reconstructing the night with precision of someone who had spent years mapping the phenomenon across the Australian landscape. He measured distances, angles, sight lines. He stood between the shed and the cypress hedge, that narrow gap the craft had passed through, and noted how little room there was for anything of that size to move without disturbing the environment. But nothing was disturbed. There was no broken branches, no displaced leaves, and there wasn't any sign of turbulence. Chalker found that deeply significant. He mapped the trajectory of the craft from the caretaker's first sighting to the water tank to the point where it descended and hovered just above the ground. He noted the livestock reactions, so the cattle's panic and the horse's frantic pacing, as corroborating behavioural evidence. Animals don't lie. Animals don't embellish. And animals don't misinterpret. To Chalker, the Rosedale encounter wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a pattern, a quiet lineage of rural sightings involving structured craft moving with intelligence at low altitude in complete silence. He'd seen this before. Not here, not exactly like this, but close enough to recognise the signature. Gary Little, the witness listener. Gary Little approached the case differently. Where Chalker focused on the physical environment, Little focused on the human one. He sat with the caretaker at the kitchen table, listening to him recount the night in slow, measured detail. Little wasn't looking for drama. He wasn't looking for excitement. He was looking for consistency. And he found it. The caretaker's story didn't shift. Not in tone, not in detail, not in emotional cadence. He described the whistle the same way each time, sharp, metallic and unnatural. He described the craft's movement with the same gestures, the same pauses and the same quiet certainty. He described the animals' reactions with the same emotional weight every time he spoke of them. Little noted something else too. Something subtle. Something easy to miss. The caretaker wasn't trying to convince him. He wasn't trying to impress him. He wasn't trying to interpret the experience. He was simply trying to tell the truth as plainly as he could. Little had interviewed dozens of witnesses over the years, some frightened, some confused, and some eager to be believed. But the caretaker was none of those things. He was steady, grounded, matter of fact. And that, to Little, was one of the strongest indicators that something extraordinary had happened to him. Keith Basterfield, the archivist. Keith Basterfield approached Rosedale with a historian's eye and a researcher's discipline. He wasn't interested in sensationalism. He wasn't interested in speculation. He was interested in the patterns. He compared the caretaker's account to the other Australian cases, not just the famous ones, but the obscure ones, the forgotten ones, the ones that lived quietly in old files and handwritten reports. And something caught his attention. The whistle. A metallic, screeching tone that appeared in a handful of rural encounters across the country. Not many and not often, but enough to matter. He noted the lack of physical traces, not as a weakness, but as a characteristic. Some encounters leave marks, others leave impressions. Rosedale was the latter. Basterfield documented the case meticulously, placing it within the broader context of the Australian UFO history. To him, Rosedale wasn't just a sighting, it was a data point, and a significant one, in a pattern of low-altitude, structured craft encounters that defied conventional explanation. Where they agreed and where they didn't. Chalker, Little and Basterfield didn't always agree on the interpretation. Chalker leaned toward patterns of intelligent movement. Little leaned toward the credibility of the witness. And Basterfield leaned toward the historical context. But they agreed on the essentials. The caretaker was credible. The craft was structured. The movement was controlled. The altitude was impossible. The silence was anomalous, and the whistle was significant. The animal reactions were consistent with other cases. And the lack of physical traces, or very few might I add, did not diminish the weight of the encounter. They also agreed on something else, something that rarely makes it into official reports: the emotional residue. The way the caretaker spoke about the night, the way he carried the memory, and the way the experience lived in him long after the craft had vanished. Encounters leave marks, not always on the ground, but always in the witnesses. So I am going to jump in there. So there is something that I haven't necessarily included in this. And the reason I haven't technically included it in my sections of scripting is because, again, this was something that, in terms of the physical evidence, it was very little, I suppose, if that makes sense. So it's sort of looking at it like, yes, there's traces of something, but it's sort of a bit hard to know whether it was because of this or if it was something else. But I do remember I was watching, I think it was Reese Dalton Morgan, who's the UFO Aussie on YouTube, and he'd actually interviewed Bill Chalker. And again, this was another documentary that I'd seen or podcast that really then piqued my interest even further into Rosedale specifically. But what was discussed was that with the way this craft had come towards the water tank, it had sort of hovered over it, and prior to it disappearing, it had actually flipped on its side and shot up. And what was interesting was that the witness had said something like he noticed that there was something on the underside. It was a bit hard to tell whether it was soil or plant matter or whatever it was. But it wasn't until it was obviously daylight that there was some evidence that the grass had been somewhat disturbed, or the natural kind of foliage on the ground had been disturbed. And there was, I believe, like a cow paddy that was in that vicinity that, looked different to those of others in the paddock, that then also kind of sparked a little bit of a speculation of, it must have hovered enough to have collected debris from the ground, but not enough to leave a really strong impression. And again, that was something that the witness had said, is when this craft had flipped on its side, he could see what looked to be like, dirt, debris sort of coming away from this craft. Another thing that was also noted was that once that craft had gone, the 10,000-gallon water tank that was pretty much reasonably full, if not properly full, was almost completely empty after this encounter. Now, there was more that I had sort of picked up in that, where there was actually sightings, I think, on the same night in some of the other surrounding towns. And a lot of the common reports that had come through was about the fact that their water tanks that had been, well over half full, if not properly to the top full, suddenly all their water was basically gone from these tanks. So that was some of the research and evidence that had come up through some of my other research. I say other research, it's when I'm watching docos or something like that. But what was interesting was that it was Bill Chalker that was talking about this. So I find it really interesting that it's, again, it's something that's kind of come up. But again, when putting this together, it's sometimes I'd rather be able to kind of just give you guys like that nice kind of story and then just pull up any additional information that I've got so that it keeps you thinking. And, if there's any other things that you may have heard of or, something that's related to that case that then pops up, you kind of go, oh yeah, that's right, or whatever. So sometimes that's the way I like to do it, is just so that it gives me the opportunity to kind of talk about some of the extra stuff that I've found that I'm curious about. I think that's the thing, is it's sort of like, well, the witness has said, well, there was water in the tank and now there's not, like what the fuck? But you can't, again, it's not like you can technically prove that this craft literally sat over the water tank and gulped up all the water when it wasn't witnessed that there was water being drained from the tank, or, the ground is very mildly disturbed. It doesn't look the same as what it should if there's animals moving through, but it's not enough to be like, oh, it's 100% like literally hit the ground and landed here. I don't recall there being sort of burn marks specifically, but there were different sort of patterns in like the grass and the soil, that it would be as if something had like almost touched it without hitting the ground entirely. So that's some of the extra research that I'd come across as well that I found really quite interesting. So yeah, if you've got any more that you know about Rosedale, let me know, because I found this quite compelling. But anyway, without further ado, let's keep on going because there's still more to come. The patterns, parallels, and the Australian landscape of the phenomenon. When investigators finished their work at Whiteacres, they didn't leave with answers. They left with something else. Something that sits at the heart of every enduring case. A pattern. Not a neat one and not a tidy one, but a pattern nonetheless. Because Rosedale doesn't stand alone. It sits in a quiet constellation of Australian encounters that share the same strange fingerprints, the same behavioural echoes, and the same atmospheric residue. And when you place them side by side, something begins to emerge. The low altitude signature. Rosedale wasn't a distant light in the sky. It wasn't a flash. It wasn't a streak. It was low and close. Structured. A craft moving 8 to 10 feet above the ground with precision and silence. And that signature, that low altitude, controlled movement, appears in other Australian cases too. Not many and not often, but enough to matter. Enough to suggest that whatever happened at Rosedale is a part of a larger behavioural pattern in the phenomenon's interactions with rural landscapes. The whistle. Rare but reoccurring element. The metallic whistle the caretaker heard is one of the most unusual aspects of this case. It's not common and it's not widespread, but it's not entirely unique either. handful of rural encounters across Australia, scattered across decades of geography, include descriptions of a similar sound: sharp, metallic, vibrational. A sound that seems to resonate rather than travel. And it's a sound that feels like it's actually inside you as much as it is around you. Investigators don't know what to make of it. There's no clear pattern and no obvious explanation. But the fact that it appears at all, even rarely, makes it significant. It's a thread, a clue, a behavioural echo that ties Rosedale to a small, strange family of cases that defy easy categorisation. The animal reactions, a consistent behavioural marker. Animals do not lie. They don't interpret and they don't rationalise. They don't fill in the gaps. They just react. And in Rosedale, the animals reacted before the caretaker even woke. The cattle were bellowing in panic. The horse was tearing across the yard. And the tension in the air that only animals seem to sense before humans catch up. This pattern appears again and again in rural Australian encounters. Mundrabilla, Booyop Brook, Kempsey, and even the lesser-known cases that never made headlines but live quietly in old reports. Animals sense something that we don't. Or is it something that we can't? And their reactions often mark the beginning of the encounter, long before the witness sees anything at all. The Australian landscape, a quiet stage for the strange. There's something about rural Australia that holds these stories differently. The wide paddocks, the long roads, and the silence that stretches for kilometres. The way the sound travels across open land. The way the darkness settles like a physical presence. Encounters here feel intimate, very close, very personal. Not because they're small, but because the land itself creates a kind of acoustic and emotional chamber where the phenomenon feels amplified. In the city, lights drown out the dark, and noise drowns out the silence, and movement drowns out the stillness. But in places like Rosedale, there's nowhere for the strange to hide. When something enters the night, the land feels it. The animals feel it. The witnesses feel it. And the story becomes a part of the landscape. Parallels across the country. So when you place Rosedale alongside other Australian cases, a quiet lineage emerges, and it's not in a straight line, not in a neat progression, but in a constellation. Mundrabilla, the car lifted, the metallic sound, the animals reacting. Tully, the structured movement, the precision, the silence. Kempsey, the low altitude craft and the behavioural echoes. Booyop Brook, the livestock panic, the atmosphere is charged. Melton, the structured lights, the controlled descent. Different places, different witnesses, and different decades, but the same quiet fingerprints, the same behavioural signatures, and the same sense that something moves through the rural landscape with intention. Which, as I was saying before about the water tank and the water being gone, there's intention. The mythic undercurrent and why these stories endure. There's a reason rural encounters carry a different emotional weight. It's not just the silence. It's not just the isolation. It's not just the intimacy of the experience. It's the mythic resonance, the visitor in the night, the disturbance in the paddock, the animals sensing what we cannot, the witness stepping into the dark and finding something waiting there. These are old patterns, older than the phenomenon, older than the land. They echo through folklore, through Dreamtime stories, through the human instinct to look into the darkness and feel that something is actually looking back. Rosedale isn't just a case, it's an archetype, a modern expression of an ancient pattern that lives quietly in the human psyche, and that's why it matters. For all the patterns and the parallels, for all the investigative work and the historical context, and the behavioural signatures of the phenomenon, Rosedale still comes down to one man standing alone in the dark. Because encounters don't happen to landscapes. They don't happen to case files. They don't happen to the patterns. They happen to people. And the caretaker, this quiet, grounded, practical man, carried the weight of that night in a way that no report can fully capture. When the investigators left, the farm didn't change. The shed was still the shed. The hedge was still the hedge. The silo still cast its long shadow across the yard. And the water tank still stood like a concrete sentinel in the centre of the property. But he had changed. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way anyone else would notice. But in the quiet, internal way that happens when the world you thought you knew shifts beneath your feet. He went back to his routines, feeding the cattle, checking the fences, walking the paddocks at dawn. But the night lived in him. The whistle, the movement, the silence, and the way the craft had hovered with a kind of deliberate intelligence that made the hair on his arms stand up. Interesting, because that's what happened to me while reading this. He didn't talk about it much, not because he was afraid of being judged, but because he didn't have the language for it. So, how do you explain something that left really no trace, but changed everything? How do you describe a sound that felt like it was inside your body? How do you talk about a craft that moved with precision through a space that was too narrow for any human-made craft? He tried once or twice to put it into words, but the words felt small, inadequate, and too fragile to hold the weight of the experience. So he carried it quietly, not as a burden, but as a truth. A truth that didn't need validation. A truth that didn't need belief. It was a truth that was simply his. He wasn't a man prone to fear. He wasn't a man prone to imagination. He wasn't a man prone to exaggeration. He was a man who had seen something that didn't belong to this world, and he lived with that knowledge the way rural men live with everything, quietly, steadily, and without fuss. But there were moments, small, private moments, when a memory would rise up with clarity that startled him. A whistle that was carried in the wind, a shadow moving across the paddock at dusk, the sudden silence of animals when they're sensing something unseen. And in those moments, he felt that the night would return. Not the fear, not the panic, just the presence. The sense of being observed. The sense of being a part of something he didn't understand and couldn't explain. He never claimed to know what the craft was. He never claimed to know where it came from. And he never claimed to know why it was there. He only claimed what he had seen, what he had heard, and what he had felt. And that honesty, that quiet, steady certainty, is what makes Rosedale endure. Because the phenomenon doesn't just leave marks on the land, it leaves marks on people. And the caretaker carried his mark with the same quiet dignity he carried everything else in life. Not as a story, not as a mystery, but as a truth. A truth that lived in him long after the investigators left, long after the reports were filed, and long after the world had moved on. A truth that still echoes in the paddocks of White Acres on quiet nights when the wind moves through the hedge and the animals shift uneasily, as if remembering something they can't quite name. When you strip away the measurements and the maps and the investigator notes, when you set aside the diagrams and the timelines and the careful reconstruction of the night, you're left with something quieter, something harder to name, and something that lives in the space between fact and feeling. Rosedale is not a spectacle. It's not a mass sighting. It's not a headline. It's a moment. A quiet, unsettling moment where the extraordinary world cracked open just enough for someone else to slip through. And maybe that's why it matters. Because the truth of the phenomenon isn't always found in the big cases, the ones with all the photographs and the radar returns and the dozens of witnesses all pointing to the same patch of sky. Sometimes the truth lives in the small ones, the forgotten ones, the ones that leave no trace except the memory of a single person standing barefoot in the dark, trying to understand what just moved through their world. There's something profoundly human about encounters like Rosedale, not because they're dramatic, but because they're intimate. A man wakes to a sound that doesn't belong. Animals panic in the night. A craft moves with intelligence through a space too narrow for anything we've built. And then it's gone. No message, no contact, no explanation. Just the silence. The charged, heavy silence that settles after the impossible. And in that silence, something lingers. Not fear, not wonder, something older. A recognition, a sense, deep in the bones, that the world is wider and stranger and far more layered than we allow ourselves to believe. Encounters like Rosedale don't demand belief. They don't ask for conclusions. They don't offer answers. They offer something else. A question. A quiet, persistent question that lives in the back of the mind long after the night has passed. What moves through our world when we're not looking? What intelligence slips between the paddocks and the hedges and the long rural roads under the cover of darkness? What presence observes us with the same curiosity we project into the sky? And why do these moments choose the people they chose? The caretaker didn't ask for this. He didn't seek it. He didn't chase it. It came to him. It moved through his world with precision and silence and left him with a truth he could never be expected to carry. And maybe that's the heart of it. The phenomenon doesn't just leave marks on the land. It leaves marks on people. Quiet, invisible marks. Marks that don't show up in photographs or soil samples or investigator reports. These are marks that live in memory. in the way a person pauses when they hear a strange sound at night, in the way they look at the sky a little differently afterward, in the way that they carry that knowledge that the world is not as closed as we pretend it is. Rosedale is one of those stories, a quiet story, a small story, but a story that opens the door into something very vast, something that moves with intelligence, something that observes, something that chooses its moments carefully. It's something that leaves the world unchanged except for the person who witnessed it. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the truth of the phenomenon isn't found in the spectacular, but in the subtle, in the whistle that cuts through the night, in the animals that sense what we cannot, in the craft that moves with impossible grace through a narrow gap in the dark, in the silence that follows, in the man who stands alone in a yard trying to understand what just passed through his life. These are the stories that shape the edges of our understanding. These are the stories that remind us that the world is stranger and more wondrous than we would allow ourselves to imagine. And these are the stories that we will follow. The ones that whisper, the ones that linger, and the ones that leave a mark. And that concludes the Rosedale UFO case. Now, I hope that you have enjoyed this episode. If this is something that's intrigued you or you really, really enjoyed the content, please leave a comment, like and subscribe. It really does go a long way. It also helps our podcast get seen and recognised by fellow paranormal enthusiasts just like you and I. So, what do we think of Rosedale? Is it something that you knew? Is it something that you'd never heard before? Have you got more information on it that I might have missed? Again, reach out, leave it in the comments, let me know. But for now, thank you for joining me. I've really enjoyed this episode. And as always, remember, stay grounded, of course, stay curious, and always expect the unexpected. I will see you in the next episode. Bye for now.